Nandan, is it fair to say the best is yet to come?
Well, I don't know.
And Vinod, I would say this is true for you as well. I think both of you, your new avatar is about bringing orbit shifts, societal scale orbit shifts. And I think even if you are able to bring one of them about, I think the impact of that would be probably more significant than the one, significant moments that you've already had. So what propels you to do this? At this age, you can certainly sit back, have an island, retire,
Already, Vinod has a massive beach, private beach.
So why, Vinod, I know it works 80 hours a week, right, Vinod? Is that fair?
That is fair. I have this fear that you can go old when you retire, not retire when you grow old. So I hope I never retire. Look, as long as you have interesting problems to work on, there's nothing more exciting to do than work on them, whatever the scale. And it's amazing what individual people can achieve. I don't think Aadhar would be here without Nandan. There's lots and lots of very large problems to be worked on, and so really great mountains to climb and challenges, and it keeps me motivated.
So, the wonderful part of this, having interacted with both of you, is that even today, you see yourself as the Davids in a David versus Goliath battle, right? And because you scale up the problems, and the problems are so big, right, then it now requires this asymmetric kind of a relationship that you have with the problem. And you need to now be really smart and disciplined to be able to solve that problem, right? Because the scope of the problem is now so significant. So where is that a fair description of the mental model that you have, that you're comfortable in being this underdog trying to solve this big problem?
Well, you want to be the underdog. You want problems to be hard. If they were easy to solve, somebody would have solved them. But I think there's a useful technique in our world that people generally don't understand. Those problems are very large when you look at them initially. If you apply exponential learning to them, exponentials catch up with any problem very quickly. If you get on the right path to exponential solutions, they're not as hard as they seem. Just starting to solve the whole problem in one step is like trying to climb Mount Everest in one step and go straight to the top without going to base camp or camp 1 or camp 2 along the way.
Nandan, some people argue that this kind of a mindset that Vinod is talking about is somewhat new to India, right? Because you go to Vietnam, Vietnam has this culture saying we were the underdogs, with respect to the Chinese one time, then the French, and then the Americans, and we overcame there. US has a very strong culture, which kind of celebrates the Davids and the David versus Goliath battle. But culturally, that is not the case here in India. When our Ram went to conquer Ravan, he had an army bigger than Ravan's at that time. So we don't have a cultural construct which celebrates David versus Goliath. How do you overcome that? What's your advice to the people here? How should they put themselves in a frame of thinking that would allow them to embrace some of this approach that Vinod is talking about?
Well, I think, of course, there has been an approach. I mean, India didn't get independent without big thinking. So, to that extent, I think it's been there before too. Or India's first election was a great example of big thinking. So, I think it's all there. But we are applying it in new ways. I think my feeling is that we shouldn't be daunted by the size of the problem. I think whether you're solving a small problem or a large problem, it requires the same amount of thinking. So you might as well solve the large problem because that's much more value for your time and money. So that's how I would view it. And I think today all the young people here who are planning companies really have, on one side, an extraordinary array of things that need to be fixed. On the other side, they have an extraordinary array of tools and technology that can fix those problems. And they have access both to enormous amounts of capital and great talent. So to my mind, I can't think of a better time when you take up the challenge of solving these big problems. And as we have seen in many cases, you can always solve them if you solve them one step at a time.
So, with your old alma mater, Stanford, we've been doing an event called Startup Bridge India, where we convince them that Silicon Valley will innovate for the first billion, and India will innovate for the next 6 billion. Together, we'll innovate for the world. Now that we put that stake in the ground, we got to have our entrepreneurs step up to this. So, what is it? Share with us. You have had so much of experience dealing with these breakthrough kind of entrepreneurs. What does it take? What kind of a mindset should they have? What must they unlearn? What must they learn, and what must they unlearn to make that happen?
The first thing I would say is, in my experience, most people, most of the time, are limited by what they think they can do, not what they can actually do. So most people limit themselves. It's a surprising thing to say, but I almost always find it to be true. The other thing is having the courage to take one little step at a time on this exponential climb. You don't have to figure out the whole journey to start the journey. You figure it out along the way. When you're treading new ground, you will find new problems that don't have previous solutions, and you just have to be creative. Now, necessity is the mother of invention. When a startup runs into a big problem, it finds all kinds of solutions. So this attitude that I don't mind trying and I don't mind failing and getting up and trying again, along with not letting your current thinking of what you think you can do limit you. I think it's a mindset, it's a culture, it's an approach that's very, very different. Just to encourage those of you entrepreneurs in the audience, I looked back at 40 years and looked at major innovations. I couldn't find one major innovation that came from a large company. Not one. General Motors and Volkswagen couldn't design an electric car, despite trying. Boeing and Airbus couldn't do space like SpaceX could. None of the media companies did media like Twitter and Facebook did. None of the pharma companies did biotechnology like Genentech did. I couldn't find one example in 40 years where the innovation, large innovation, not incremental innovation. Yes, Intel go from a 16 nanometer process to a 7 nanometer process because the path is pretty clear early. But when the path isn't clear, when you're inventing something new, almost certainly it'll be somebody who's a startup, as hard as it sounds. In energy, when people look to General Electric and Siemens to innovate, it wasn't any of them. Batteries came from other places. No matter where you look, the answer came from some startup that learned very rapidly and got on a very fast learning curve. That combined with not being afraid to fail is really the combination. I always say my willingness to fail gives me the ability to succeed. And most people fail to try instead of trying and failing. And then they fail before they start.
So these entrepreneurial heroes who are going through this roller coaster, right? Unreasonable kind of journeys that they are going on. It does seem that they have something working for them on the back end. Yeah, usually it is some public infrastructure or some kind of a major transition that has happened in the industry that kind of opens up the opportunity for them to do that. So even if you go back, my early days were as a Unix kernel engineer, right? So I passed out in '86. And so if you look at mid-'80s, right, you could go back and trace Solaris as a beneficiary of AT&T Bell Labs having opened up Unix, to the rest of the world. So almost every major transition has had something working for them. Nandan, is that your view as well? I mean, do you see the world in those?
Yeah. No. I'm all for Vinod's view of the entrepreneur and his role, but I think all these entrepreneurial successes have been built on huge investments in public infrastructure by governments. The internet is fundamentally was created by the government, and till Netscape built its browser in 1995, it was a public infrastructure funded by DARPA, etc., etc. The whole GPS system was designed by government and allowed you to, get your lat long, and later on you had the Google Maps and the Ubers. So I'm a firm believer that we need to invest in long-term digital infrastructure, which has to be done by governments because they are the only people who can afford it or have that vision. And then, but they need to do it in a way that they open it up for private innovation. So at least that's the philosophy that we have adopted in India, saying that just as the US invested in internet and GPS and so on, we will invest in identity, payment infrastructure, all the various things we have done. And then, but do it in a way that you apify the whole thing and allow innovation to happen on top of that. So that combines the best of public investment and private innovation.
I want to...
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with that because almost all entrepreneurs build on things that are already there. In fact, how much you orient that infrastructure towards entrepreneurial ventures makes a huge difference. If you look at science funding, there's a whole lot of startups in the US based on all the government funding for science and technology in US universities. Now the same happens in Europe, but the Europeans don't open up their infrastructure for entrepreneurs in the same way that the US universities do. So it's a great example of you have to have the basic research and you have to enable entrepreneurs to take advantage.
Also, I think the US has one other difference, which is and it's true in India as well as in Europe, is that there they fund government money to traditional research labs. But I think the way that the DARPA and NSF and all fund challenge grant kind of thing, I mean, autonomous cars came out of a DARPA grant. So when you look at everything you find behind, there's a government grant given to somebody who came up with an idea and then it took off. So I think the way the government invests, one is to build infrastructure like the internet, and even the internet was built using DARPA challenge. So, and second is create this kind of environment where people innovate, and then so I think it's also important how we do it.
In AT&T Bell Labs, if you go back in 1955, we're talking about blockchain and AI. At that time, the big thing was the transistor. And then AT&T said, what, if an American entrepreneur wishes to commercialize this, we won't assert our patent rights. So if you were a Canadian entrepreneur, you're a British, German, Japanese entrepreneur, you didn't have that opportunity that opened up for you. And then when Fairchild's, what's his name? Shockley broke away to do that, if you read his biographies, you see that his biggest fear was that I'm going to make so much of money that they may change their mind. So that's when Terman said, hey, come west, move as far away as possible. So I think and that's how Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley. So
Terman was the dean of engineering at Stanford University in the 50s, and literally enabled the ecosystem of startups around Stanford.
And even I think the fact that in 1957, when there was this so-called Sputnik moment, when the Russians launched a satellite and all, with a person and all that, that's what drove the Americans to do their own space program, and Kennedy said man on the moon in 10 years. And that also drove the miniaturization of electronics, because they had to make it very light so you could build a small satellite. So a lot of the semiconductor stuff that happened in the valley happened because of that.
Exactly. And so I think we are in agreement, if I may venture to say, that if you really have to solve hard societal problems, it is, if I use a Hindi word, jugalbandi, which may resonate with you. It's a jugalbandi between public kind of research, public infrastructure that's been created, and private innovation, right? And when the two come together, and you're right, Europe hasn't done a good job of making that happen. The US has done a good job. What is it, Nandan, that India needs to be careful about, so that we are very early in that journey. You talked about DARPA coming up in 1958, which was essentially a result of finding a way to send defense research to universities after the war. So what is it that we need to do now, so many years later, so that we get this right and we don't fall into the trap let's say, of the Europeans and miss the boat here?
Well, I think, I don't think we have cracked the problem in traditional research. Still, if you look at traditional research, it's done in the traditional way. But I think the advantage we have in this kind of technology stuff that we do is that thanks to the internet guys, we have technology which has been democratized. You have all kinds of open source stuff, you have the cloud, you have, it's all there, it's all free. And for us, therefore, to take that and mix and match that in a way to solve problems, it becomes so much easier. And that's where I think, at least that's where we can do a lot of work. I mean, when you look at the Aadhar stack, which people like Sanjay and Pramod and all designed, it's an entirely an open source stack. So we build the cheapest ID system in the world using a completely open source commodity hardware, highly scalable architecture. Or even UPI, which does 800 million transactions, inside is a very, very high performance, low cost infrastructure. So I think the fact that we're able to repurpose these ideas and apply them to making it operate at scale is, I think, one of the things that we can do. I think today it's not a technology problem. It is how do we reconfigure all these things and apply them to solve things at scale.
I want to spend a little more time. Yeah, I want to explore this a little further. So, NIH probably accounts for more than 50% of the health R&D in the world. Is that fair to say, give or take?
33 billion.
Yeah. So give or take some. Now, the point is, out of that will emerge a number, people will commercialize that research over time. And clearly, a lot of that will happen in the hands of the entrepreneurs. Do you think there are some sectors, Vinod, where for a variety of reasons, this commercial entrepreneurship is not the best way to bridge the gap between research and the problem, and either philanthropic energy has to step in or government has to step in? What are your thoughts about that? Or do you think the commercial entrepreneurship is going to kind of address all classes of problems that we'll
No, it won't. Whenever something can be done commercially, you get huge jump in efficiency and speed at which it can be done. But public health is an example. Public education is an example of things that will need governmental or other institutions to make that happen. So I don't think entrepreneurship is the only way, but for non-governmental stuff, there's a lot it can do. I mean, disaster relief, for example, is not something entrepreneurs will do well.
Or Bill Gates would say toilets falls in that category, right? I mean, so Nandan, is there, in India, if we have to create this innovation on top of the infrastructure that is coming up, we really need to do a lot more with respect to local entrepreneurship, right? We are very early in that journey. We still have a long way to go. What about some of the other elements, that philanthropic element, let's say for education, where I know both of you are involved, Rohini and Neetu are here. What about some of the other areas? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think that education is a good place because I think Neetu is also working. We're all working. I think it's a great place for a philanthropic thing. And our view is that you need to create the infrastructure which can then be repurposed and redeployed by all these people, which is what we do. And that will be done only by philanthropy because governments can't do it. It's too futuristic for governments to fund. And markets won't do it because there's no money in it. So it has to be philanthropic. So I think where there is a market failure or where the innovation dimension is so high that governments may not do it that well, I think philanthropy has a huge role to play.
So let's come back to the market now, because that is the majority of the area. That's really the exciting part. That's the fast moving part. And all the entrepreneurs are here. They sometimes, through their lens, they see you as a pot of money walking around. And they say, hey, how can I get money from a VC? And I know you have strong opinions about that. It'll be good to, share some of those with the entrepreneurs here. What is it, how should they be framing this problem from, if you were in their shoes, what would you suggest to them? How should they frame this, raise money from a VC problem?
You know, there's never one solution. There's not one formula. In the end, as an investor, especially a technology investor, you're looking for some unique solution where one can create an advantage over time. It's really as simple as that. The biggest ingredient of doing that is the quality of the team you assemble. So if there's a great team, we'll fund it whether it's doing a good thing, interesting business plan or not. So the team matters the most, and then how clever you are, how differentiated your technology is, how far ahead are you of others in thinking through how you want to build it. One of the things about iterative learning, when you jump into an area and start iterating, you can iterate for a long time without results, and then you get to a good enough solution that it takes off. If you start that process, you'll do better than others, and others following behind you will have that same period of learning. So it's a pretty simple, it's common sense, I would say, though there's no formula.
Is there a glut of money in Silicon Valley right now? You know, we don't have that glut of money here yet, or so it seems, but at a later stage, definitely, but at the early stage, that's not the case. Are you worried about that? Do you think that's kind of changing some of this dynamic that you're talking about?
You know, look, nobody can say what's the right level of money. It feels like a lot of money floating around in Silicon Valley, but that's because there's been a lot of really good ideas. The fact is, when new platforms emerge, new applications become possible, and then great entrepreneurs come build those applications. If you look at your mobile phone and the touch interface, there really hasn't been a huge startup in the US in the last 5 years. If you look at Uber or Lyft or Airbnb or Pinterest, they're all done sort of in that period from 2007 when the iPhone came out, Facebook came out, to about 2012. Things have been pretty incremental since then on that platform, because entrepreneurs experimented on that platform and developed new things. So you have to say, where are new platforms coming along? I do think AI is a new platform and offers lots and lots of opportunity. Fortunately, other than ads, it offers opportunity in lots of societally impactful areas. Medicine's my favorite. But even 3D printing is a new platform that people aren't using enough. One of my favorite startups right now is trying to 3D print whole houses. What's the advantage of that? Much, much lower cost, 24 hours to print a house, but more importantly, its environmental footprint is much better. You look at combining CRISPR-like tools in biology with AI, and suddenly all kinds of disease solutions are possible that were not possible before. Drug discovery using AI techniques is phenomenal area. I am almost certain no pharma company will do well at that. And startups will dominate drug discovery using AI as a fundamental technology, because you can do a 10 to the 4, 10 to the 5 improvement in your search space. So I could go on. No matter which area you look, and this is a point I really want to make to the whole group, there aren't only certain areas around software where you can innovate. 7 years ago, when we started Impossible Foods, people said, what are you doing investing in hamburgers? It has a larger carbon footprint than electric cars. So if we can save cruelty to animals, health for humans who consume red meat, and save the planet, it's a pretty damn good thing.
They may not know what impossible.
Impossible
Tell me
is
more about the burger.
is a vegetarian burger. I hate to call it vegetarian because the company only wants to sell it to meat eaters. That tastes the same as meat. Most people cannot distinguish between that and a real hamburger, except it doesn't come from an animal.
And the implications of this, could you elaborate a little? Because a lot of that carbon,
Yeah.
you know, what are the societal benefits of making
So
that
about the
happen?
30 to 40% of the planet's land area is used for animal husbandry of one sort or another. Think about it. 90% of it could be freed up if the same meat was produced using techniques like Impossible Burger. So plant proteins are the best way to save the planet, and it's healthier than meat proteins for humans because they come with cholesterol and other negative things. So it's a beautiful solution. We just got to scale it. So my point was really, whether it's food, whether it's buildings, construction, transportation, education, healthcare, they're all open to radical innovation with technology.
You know, I want you
That's
to
the optimist in me.
and
That's why I have too many problems for the remaining part of my life left.
So Vinod, I'm going to keep you on this subject for another moment because I want to then use a segue with what Nandan has also done. You know, in this case, I think the entrepreneur was a professor, right? And
Yes, never had a job before.
And so tell a little bit of that story, because one of Nandan's biggest investments, which he never talks about, I want him to do that, is Sedimac, which is also where IIT Bombay professor is game-changing stuff in the auto field. But before we come to that, why don't you tell the story a little bit about the entrepreneur there? What happened there?
You know, it sounds ridiculous, but a professor who had never had a job other than research, he invented, for those of you who in the biology field, he was a genetics professor, invented chip arrays for biology, for identifying genes. Was a very creative guy, came to me and said, I'm going to give up my tenure at Stanford, but if you fund me to eliminate animal husbandry on the planet. Now, that sounds about as ridiculous a claim as you could get, but he was so passionate and willing to give up tenure at Stanford that I said we'd back him. And it's gone far better than I ever imagined. So now we showed him up with lots of management support and other things, but it's been a wonderful journey. He's still running the company 7, 8 years later.
And, you know, I don't know whether Ashwin, I saw him a little while back, Ashwin formerly of the India Innovation Fund. He invested in Sedimac way back. He's the one who got Shashi Kiran to take the same leap. And then, of course, at some point in time, you invested in him.
Yeah.
So tell a little bit about, you know, is this sensible? Is there hope for people who have generally worked in multinational, cushy jobs to become entrepreneurs?
Oh, absolutely. As long as they're willing to give up the 5-star hotel stuff,
Okay.
I mean, then that's all that's required. No, I think anybody. I mean, Shashi is a great example. He's a prof of IIT and he's done an amazing work on this, you know, ignition and so on. And it's an electronic product which is now going into all kinds of two-wheelers, four-wheelers. It's really a great innovation. Even the big guys in that industry don't have something like that. So it's really creating an, you know, global innovation from India. So I think you can be from any walk of life. I mean, I don't think there's a particular requirement that you have a particular profile. And today we are seeing more and more entrepreneurs from very diverse profiles.
And, you know, on the other hand, we also have this situation where sometimes the entrepreneurs, instead of, because of the shortage of equity capital in India, end up relying on debt capital. And then debt capital is in some ways less forgiving when things go wrong. And you have very bad outcomes as a result of that. You know, Silicon Valley avoids that by and large. And, you know, what has India to learn, Nandan, from this?
So can I make one point? In my experience at least, the more money you raise initially, the less likely you are to succeed. there's some beauty and elegance in very small amounts of money because it forces you to think about your problem much harder. If you get a lot of money, you start executing without analyzing the problem as well. When you have to be hyper efficient with your dollars, you're much more creative with your solutions. So my experience is that less money actually makes you more creative and is more likely to create a large breakthrough. More money later when the model is figured out and you're hyper-scaling actually helps. But more money early is a disadvantage in my view.
No, I would agree with. I think all innovation comes out of necessity. Every innovation in the planet came out of some necessity. And all innovation comes out of constraints, whether they are financial constraints or product constraints or market constraints. It's only when you constrain someone that they will think their way out of the problem. I mean, so you have to set impossible goals. Otherwise, just nothing happens.
Constraints are one of the best things for innovation, period. I echo that.
And constraints, and of course, so therefore at that time you want to really find the best people who will work alongside you to make that
and
happen.
The most creative and most diverse set of thinkers.
Talk a little bit about that, because you know, you talk of saying you are a venture assistant, you don't attend board meetings, you know, the primary value add that you have is helping people build teams. Tell us a little more about your thinking.
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. I said earlier that none of the large innovations I could track came from an existing large company in that space. I can tell you that in most cases, the innovation came from somebody who had never worked in that area. Right? Elon Musk hadn't worked in cars. And the automakers sort of laughed at a Silicon Valley startup with no experience in automaking. Now, he made lots of mistakes, but he fixed them quickly, and he figured out a better way than they would have figured out applying conventional wisdom. You know, no fintech startup has come out of anybody who knew fintech well. If you look in the US, at least, we were investors in Square and Stripe and Affirm. None of those people had ever worked in fintech. So not knowing a space is a massive advantage. In healthcare, when I work with healthcare, I don't work with healthcare people in healthcare startups because they don't innovate enough.
Can I ask a question? There are many healthcare startups here. We're in a hospital. There is a healthcare startup here, right, which is looking for a VP of sales. Should they hire somebody who has worked in the health system before?
No.
Okay, elaborate that, please.
I'd rather get a great athlete who'll get to know healthcare fairly well in 6 months. A salesperson from healthcare will know healthcare day one, but will not innovate very rapidly. A salesperson somewhere outside will learn healthcare, will not be as productive, but in 6 months will be much more innovative. And I've seen this over and over and over again. At least I have a strong belief that people with expertise in the area apply old rules, old biases. Experience is one of the largest biases there is. If you have 20,
this
30...
sounds like a Trumpian argument.
No, unlearning is more important than learning. This is what I think. But you know, I actually fully agree with you. But I want to take this a little further. You know, here is a startup which completely buys your argument and says, good, this is what I wish to do. And then they have a board meeting day after tomorrow, and their other investors, VC investors, give them diametrically opposite advice. How should they deal with those VC investors that are on their board?
Well, look, it's a hard question. That's why I stopped going to board meetings. But it was an easy thing for me to do. I just spent time one-on-one with entrepreneurs. I get this question a lot. In fact, there's a startup in India who's been asking me for advice because their VC board members are advising them to do the traditional thing. Look, it's a hard thing. Entrepreneurs have great belief in themselves, and you have to have that belief. It's sort of a unique combination of arrogance because you have belief in yourself and paranoia because you're trying to learn and you keep failing. Combining those in an unusual way is what entrepreneurs, the good entrepreneurs, do really well. Confident in their belief, but confident not that they know, but confident that they will figure it out through a series of iterations and mistakes.
So in this unlearning, when they hit an obstacle and they kind of reimagine what they have to do, they give up stuff, they may be focused on a consumer market, they go into a different market segment, they reject the whole proposition. There are some things they ought not to reject, which is their values. Now, this is something, Nandan, I would say, has been what is special about Infosys, and I would say even Wipro, right? Mr. Premji and Narayan Murthy created a culture which was value-based culture, which was bigger than themselves. And I think we are all beneficiaries of that culture, and Bangalore certainly is a beneficiary of that. I want both of you to comment a little bit about this unchanging core that you want to have in any business, which is your values. Nandan,
No, I think that's very, very important, because I think if we want to build companies to last, if we want to build companies that sustain themselves over decades and really have an impact on society and the world, they have to be anchored in a core set of values, core beliefs, and all that. So I think that's very, very important. And I think all the great companies have done that. I mean, otherwise you'll be a flash in the pan. You'll just, but to do it at scale and speed requires that.
So in these 21 months that you're back in Infosys, what has been your biggest, challenge that you have faced, where your values were asking you to do one thing, but the exigencies of the situation were trying to...
No, I didn't have any conflict. My main role in Infosys is being there. That's all.
All right.
I'd agree completely with this values argument. If you don't have values, there's two problems. First, the first time you run into a problem, people scatter. If you have values and you have a mission, people stick together and double their efforts as a team. The kind of team you assemble if you have values is very different than the kind of team you assemble if you don't. So I do think, because every startup goes through good times and goes through bad times, the values play up in a huge way during the bad times, when a team comes together and solves seemingly impossible problems.
I want to come back to funding a little bit and see, because there's a conversation that is taking place in India because of this sad kind of episode that took place. And part of this is to do with how we process risk, how we deal with risk. We in iSpirit are big fans of Saras Saraswati, affordable loss. I know you are a big fan of Nassim Taleb's way of looking at risk. Tell us a little bit. Because a startup inevitably is dealing with risk. The investors are dealing with risk. The people who are going to join that startup, the employees are dealing with risk. Share with us the right framework for looking at risk in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, look, there's no one framework for everybody. I have my own particular framework. Most investors reduce risk to the point where the probability of success is high, but the consequences of success are inconsequential. It's a perfectly good way to get predictable rates of return. I personally find it much more exciting where the probability of success is low, but the consequences of success are really consequential. Those are trade-offs, and there's a place between these two extremes for every investing strategy, and they can all be good strategies. There's not just one strategy. It depends on the investor, and frankly, it behooves an entrepreneur to find an investor who matches the approach they're trying to take. If you ask Larry and Sergey early on, they had no interest in making $1 billion. None. When Yahoo offered them $1 billion relatively early, they passed on it. They said no. And they had not very much of a company. They said, we want to change the world. They took a much higher risk profile, but they wanted to be consequential. So I think there's all sorts of places an entrepreneur can choose in terms of the risk spectrum.
And same is true with Mark Zuckerberg. But these are examples where things worked out. For each one of them, there must be 10, 12, maybe 100 examples where it did not work out, right? Yeah. And there were bad consequences. Now, when there are bad consequences in the valley, there is a social net. You know, you can
restart another company,
right,
quite easily.
You can land on your feet. You have more market value. You can go back and work for somebody. You can restart. It's the social stigma because it's your business that's failed. You haven't failed. Why has that not taken root in India, Nandan? You know, because we clearly facing that problem here. Tell us a little more. What is it that we need to do to get to that point? Because that's an essential ingredient of being able to get this engine going, entrepreneurship engine going in India.
No, I think obviously you need a social fabric which which delinks the failure from the person, which actually recognizes that failure is a tremendous experience, which is actually likely to increase the probability of success the next time around and so on, which is what happens there. Here I think the failure in the person and the institution all get entwined, and that leads to consequences.
An important characteristic when evaluating somebody who's failed is what's their rate of learning, right? That's probably the most important way you evaluate an entrepreneur. I will tell you, second-time entrepreneurs fail as often as first-time entrepreneurs. It's just not as well understood. But people who learn fast will succeed, and I hope that culture develops here, where you're evaluating the rate of learning of a person, not just whether they've been successful or not.
I was a little surprised, Vinod, earlier in one of our earlier meetings, you were exceedingly respectful to the doctors. Now, that's not been your public persona. You've been, tell us a little bit why you believe radiologists are, you know, kind of going to become irrelevant, right? Why oncologists of all people
and
are
in the hospital, again in St. John's.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about why do you think that is the case?
Well, take the simple idea of the number of physicians, doctors in India and the population of India and that ratio. If you wanted to achieve the ratio that is in the West, say in the US today, you couldn't train enough doctors in the next 30 years. You just can't. The other thing is doctors are human beings and they have limitations of human beings. So if you say, how should you use the doctors we do have? It's for the human element of care, not for being a detective. Dr. House, if you're familiar with that Western TV show. You know, not every doctor is that brilliant. They can't keep up with the last 5,000 articles published on prostate cancer. They can't keep up with the comorbidity between 3 different diseases and how it changes practice. Very few people know that. Let me tell you a simple fact, since we are here in India. If anybody takes a statin, I'm sure many of you take statins. 1 billion people on the planet take statins. I haven't run into an Indian cardiologist yet who knows that the dosage for Indians is very different than the standard dosage. Why? Because it's buried in literature somewhere that most Indian cardiologists haven't read about dosage for Indians. Even in well-known institutions like Stanford, I've asked this question of cardiologists. Not once, Indian cardiologists at Stanford, not once have I gotten the right answer. My point is, there's too much knowledge to assimilate. Cancer, every day we are seeing a new mutation being characterized and therapy being developed for a new mutation. Which oncologist can remember the gene mutations that need certain treatments? These are not things for human beings to do. But telling somebody they have cancer is a human function. That's what human beings should be doing.
So let's make it more practical. Let's say we were to set up a new hospital here, right? We got some piece of land and we have the money to set up a new kind of a hospital. How would you physically design it differently from the way the current hospitals exist?
So first, there's
given these, the new
there's
model that you're
many
talking
kinds of, there's in-office, outside the hospital care. Much of that can be done over text messaging and should be done. To get you into a doctor's office where everybody else is sick and has some infection and you're there to transmit infection is a bad idea, especially if it can be done remotely at 1/10 the cost. And accessibility of healthcare is an important issue in the world, definitely in a country like India. Almost everything you do can be done at 1/10 the cost, remotely, at a pharmacy or at home, over text messaging, where you're consulting AI expertise in conjunctions initially for the next 10 years, probably in conjunction with human beings, and then decreasingly so. My son has a company building a primary care doctor. Every month they measure the percentage of text messages that the AI generates that the doctors send, and the doctor's always in the loop, that are unmodified by the doctor. That means, and they just measure monthly and the percentage keeps going up. That's the right way to set up these systems. Look forward 5 or 10 years and the percentage will approach 5% or less. And then you've multiplied a doctor 20-fold without training 20 times more doctors. The average age of physicians in the US is so high, there's more retiring than entering medical practice every day. So all I'm saying is the way to do expertise is with software AI systems. The way to ensure quality is with software systems. The way to do a blood test is not 30 things a doctor can order, but a normal blood test should result in 30,000 data points. No human being can look at it. We don't do 30,000 or even 3,000 or 300 data points because humans can't look at it. So we measure things humans can read as opposed to measure what would help the diagnosis or the treatment. We don't follow dosage and change dosage based on what's happening with blood biomarkers. Not all 7 billion people on the planet are the same, but they all get 200 milligrams of Advil.
Fascinating. So this orbit shift that's coming in health, I can relate to that. I just want to delve a little. I'm curious to figure out, because you've been focused on climate change for a long time.
By the way, hospitals are interventional,
right.
Acute care. That's pretty different than chronic care or primary care in the clinic or at home.
And that won't change, right? Because that interventional
Hospitals will change less. When a patient comes into a burn unit, you're going to need humans to handle that patient.
Sure. I'm moving to another area of orbit shift, which is to do with climate change, right? I'm kind of curious to figure out, how do you go from many of these investments that you made to now investing in fusion nuclear reactions, right? So tell us a little bit. One of your recent investments, again, I think, having a well-known professor in MIT become an entrepreneur, in something as bizarre.
Well, we invested, for those of you who are interested, we invested in a fusion company. My big thing was, it's probably a stupid investment, but if it works, it saves the planet. So somebody had to do it. And I just helped put this together because it had to be done. We should be doing it. There's an international project that has so much protocol around it, they won't do anything in the next 50 years. So some startup has to do it, not some large government body, as much as fusion feels like a government project. Look, not every investment we make is a smart investment. we make some investments because they should be done.
He's just warning you that don't use that pitch too often. It won't work all the time. But Nandan, before we open it up a little while from now with Q&A, we probably India doesn't have a strong play in fusion, but we've managed to create kind of models that the people want from us: ID, payments, and data. Why is it that we are seeing the interest that we are from around the world in trying to copy the data infrastructure that India is starting to put in place? Can you spend a few minutes sharing with the audience what's happening, what's on its way, why is it materially important from a global perspective?
No, I think the big breakthrough which is happening is, I think it's very clear that how data is organized and managed is really the heart of what's going to happen. Even AI is ultimately about data. And the way it's evolved has been, data has been used very successfully by large companies to aggregate and monetize with advertising or whatever. So that's now a well-known model of data. And we have seen how data has been used by governments for surveillance and so on. So that's also very clear. In Europe, they have been trying to be defensive about how to prevent misuse of data and GDPR. I think where the Indian model is unique, and I don't think enough people have fully internalized this, is that because of, and it happened by serendipity, I don't think it happened because there was a grand plan 10 years back, we now have a technology architecture, upcoming legal and regulatory framework, and an institutional architecture of account aggregators, all coming together to create a way for 1 billion people and 20 million businesses to access different kinds of data from different sources and apply to different applications. So I, as a consumer, can get a loan from somebody, or a small business can get the GST data and give it there to get a loan and so on. So I think this data empowerment model which has emerged in India is an absolutely unique model and has great societal benefits, as well as is going to create a lot of innovation. So I think it's really it's a big thing, and if you recollect, the launch of it happened last week on 25th in July.
What was that? Can you share with the
Yeah, so I think thanks to the work done by Samati, I think Mahesh is here, and people like Siddharth and others from MySpirit and Saurabh and all that have built this. I think it was a very successful launch because we had all the big banks. SBI was there, Axis Bank was there, IDFC Bank was there, ICICI was there, and they were all talking about how they'll use this technology. So I think they're having one more workshop in Bombay or Delhi on the 5th, and I think September 6th is the one in Bangalore, right, Mahesh? And I think many of you should come for that. So I think we're going to create a whole generation of companies that will use data empowerment. And something similar to that has happened on the UPI front. I mean, on the UPI front, we have seen so many companies coming up, PhonePe, BharatPe, and so on, all of whom are using UPI as a fulcrum, and they're creating multi-billion-dollar valuations. So clearly, all these infrastructures will create new companies which will think innovatively and out of the box. And as he said, it's going to be some new company which has no baggage which is going to crack this. So I think it's a very exciting time on this whole account aggregator framework.
We have the constraint of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.